There is something I want to share, and I want to say it as honestly as possible because this topic deserves complete truth. If I soften the words, it would take away from the deeper meaning behind what I am about to explain. What we are exploring is not the common idea of justice, where someone who causes pain eventually receives an equal consequence and everything somehow feels balanced again. Life rarely works that way. What really happens is much more complex, and in many ways, much more realistic. This is about the hidden psychological journey of an avoidant after they deeply hurt someone whose love quietly became one of the most valuable parts of their life, even if they never admitted it out loud. Even when their actions showed distance instead of closeness, that person often held a much bigger place in their emotional world than they ever understood. When I use the word betrayal, I am not speaking only about obvious actions that everyone can clearly recognize. I am also talking about the quieter forms of betrayal that leave wounds no one else can see. It is stepping away when someone needed comfort the most. It is choosing silence when simple reassurance could have changed everything. It is creating a pattern of warmth followed by distance that gives someone hope, only to slowly take it away again. It is accepting deep and sincere love without giving the same emotional effort in return. These experiences become betrayals, even when there was never any intention to cause harm. In many situations, the avoidant does not even realize what they have done. That lack of awareness is one of the most important pieces of this entire discussion. The person who experiences those moments carries them deeply, emotionally, mentally, and even physically. Those memories leave lasting marks that do not easily disappear. At the same time, inside the avoidant, a much slower and quieter process begins to develop without anyone noticing. Stay with me, because understanding this hidden process changes the entire picture. Before we can understand what eventually happens inside an avoidant, we first have to understand why they fail to see it in the beginning. Their emotional blindness was not just another detail in the story. It was the reason everything unfolded the way it did. They never imagined that hurting you would one day create consequences they could not escape, because they never truly understood what your presence meant to them. This was not because they believed you had no value, or because they deliberately pushed your importance aside. Instead, it came from the way avoidant attachment changes emotional perception. It causes them to underestimate the value of a meaningful connection while they still have it, while at the same time convincing them that losing it will not affect them very much. That is one of the greatest paradoxes of avoidant behavior. The same emotional defenses that protect them from the fear of loss also stop them from fully appreciating what they already have before it disappears. The emotional walls built to keep pain outside also block deeper feelings of love, safety, and emotional significance from fully reaching their awareness. Because of that, an avoidant can experience something incredibly rare and meaningful without realizing just how special it truly is until much later, and by then, everything may already have changed. What happens next explains why so many people never see the real story until it is too late. Because of this distorted emotional view, the avoidant makes choices without fully understanding what is actually at risk. Every withdrawal, every period of emotional distance, every moment they fail to show up consistently, every betrayal, whether obvious or subtle, happens while they are missing important emotional information. They believe they are walking away from something they can always return to whenever they decide the time feels right. They assume the relationship can survive repeated neglect, emotional inconsistency, or long periods of distance without changing forever. They convince themselves that the connection will always be waiting whenever they finally choose to reconnect. What they fail to understand is that some relationships cannot be tested over and over without consequences. Some kinds of love are completely unique, and once they are damaged beyond repair, no amount of future understanding can return them to what they once were. Their own attachment system hides this reality from them, making the emotional cost almost impossible to recognize while they still have the chance to protect what matters most. By the time that deeper understanding finally begins to appear, the opportunity to make different choices is often already gone. What makes this process even more powerful is that the real consequences almost never arrive immediately. They usually appear much later, after enough time has passed for the avoidant's emotional defenses to slowly lose their strength. That delay changes everything because it allows the emotional impact to grow quietly beneath the surface without being fully recognized. Right after the relationship ends, after the distance has already been created, or after the damage has been done, those protective defenses become even stronger. Their mind instantly begins doing what it has practiced for years. It reduces painful emotions. It reshapes uncomfortable memories. It creates explanations that make everything feel easier to accept. These unconscious strategies protect the avoidant from emotional overload, while preserving the identity they have built around emotional independence. From the outside, this often looks like complete indifference. It seems as though they moved forward without difficulty, completely untouched by what happened. For the person left behind, this can become one of the most painful experiences imaginable, because it creates the belief that the relationship never truly mattered to the avoidant at all. Yet this is one of the biggest misunderstandings in avoidant relationship dynamics. What appears to be emotional freedom is often only a temporary psychological defense, not a true reflection of what is happening deep inside. What looks like emotional distance is rarely genuine indifference. More often, it is an emotional defense working at its absolute strongest. Keep watching, because the next stage reveals what those defenses eventually fail to hide. The avoidant is unconsciously using every psychological defense available to stop themselves from feeling the full weight of what happened and everything they lost. Their calm appearance is not proof that the relationship meant very little. It is often proof that they are holding themselves together by keeping painful emotions buried far below the surface. At that stage, they simply cannot allow themselves to experience the full consequences, because doing so would shake the coping patterns they have relied on for years. Those emotional defenses help them survive, but they cannot last forever. Sooner or later, reality becomes stronger than avoidance. The turning point usually arrives when they face undeniable evidence that the person they once believed would always be within reach has truly built a life without them. It is no longer the temporary distance they imagined they could undo whenever they felt ready. Instead, they are faced with a permanent absence that quietly confirms the chapter has genuinely come to an end. Sometimes this realization comes from noticing that you are no longer emotionally available, not because you are trying to send a message or make them jealous, but because you have honestly moved on with your life. The emotional energy that once focused on them has been redirected toward your own healing, your personal growth, and your inner peace. You are no longer waiting for them to return or suddenly become different. Your life has found a new rhythm, and your happiness is no longer tied to the choices they make. At other times, the realization comes through seeing a completely different version of you. Maybe during a brief meeting, through a mutual friend, or even through a simple photograph. They notice someone who looks calmer, stronger, more confident, and more comfortable with themselves. The quiet confidence and self-respect you slowly built after the relationship become impossible to ignore. Unlike before, this new version of you moves past every emotional filter that once protected them. It forces them to face a reality they can no longer explain away or minimize. Stay with me, because this is where everything begins to change in ways most people never expect. In that moment, the real psychological reckoning finally begins, and it reaches much deeper than most people realize. What happens next is not dramatic in the way movies usually show regret. It is quieter, slower, and far more powerful. The first stage begins inside their own mind. They start looking back at the relationship with a level of clarity they never had while they were living through it. For the first time, they recognize the true value of what they once had, and the role their own choices played in losing it. This is not ordinary nostalgia or selective memory. It is a complete shift in perspective that arrives after months or sometimes years of emotional suppression. Because these realizations were delayed for so long, they return with overwhelming intensity once those psychological walls begin to weaken. The version of you they had quietly minimized in their own mind is replaced by the real person you always were. They begin remembering your emotional depth, your consistency, your kindness, and the rare way you understood parts of them that they barely understood themselves. They finally realized that your patience was never weakness. It was an extraordinary display of strength, loyalty, and commitment that very few people would have offered. What happens next reveals why this realization becomes so difficult to escape. As that clearer understanding continues to grow, another layer becomes even harder to avoid. They are no longer simply recognizing your value. They are forced to face their own responsibility. This is very different from casually admitting they made mistakes. It becomes a deep emotional awareness that reaches far beyond simple logic. With enough time and undeniable evidence, they begin replaying every important moment with painful clarity. They remember every opportunity when they could have stayed emotionally present, but instead created distance. They replay conversations where reassurance was needed, yet silence became their answer. They begin seeing the repeated cycle they created without understanding it at the time, moving closer whenever they feared losing you, then pulling away the moment genuine intimacy became possible. They recognize how they offered just enough affection to keep hope alive, while holding back the emotional openness that a real partnership required. What once seemed reasonable now appears as a repeating pattern that slowly damaged the very connection they secretly depended on, forcing them to accept the difficult truth that many of their greatest losses were created by the same emotional defenses they believed were keeping them safe. Eventually, they begin seeing every moment with a clarity that once seemed impossible. They recognize how often you responded with kindness when they answered with distance, how many times you chose patience instead of resentment, and how faithfully you carried the emotional weight of the relationship while receiving far less in return. They realize that your compassion was never something they deserved, yet you offered it freely. They also understand that they failed to appreciate it while they still had the opportunity. That awareness creates a deep sense of shame that reaches beyond ordinary regret. It is not simply realizing they made poor choices. It is recognizing that someone loved them with remarkable sincerity, while they answered from fear instead of courage. For many avoidants, this becomes one of the most emotionally painful discoveries they will ever face, because it forces them to confront a version of themselves they spent years trying not to see. When I say this betrayal can quietly reshape an avoidant's life, I do not mean everything around them suddenly collapses. Their career may continue, their daily routines may remain the same. From the outside, they may still appear successful and completely unaffected. The consequence is much quieter than that, but often far more lasting. What they lose is not only the relationship itself, they lose access to a version of themselves that only existed because of the emotional connection they shared with you. Around your presence, parts of them were slowly becoming more open, emotionally alive, and genuinely authentic. Your patience, encouragement, and steady love gently invited qualities out of them that their defenses had hidden for years. That growth was never something they created alone. It depended on the unique emotional space the relationship made possible. Through repeated withdrawal, avoidance, and emotional distance, they slowly destroyed the very environment that allowed those healthier parts of themselves to appear. What remains afterward is not truly the life they had before meeting you. In many ways, it becomes a smaller version of it. Before the relationship, they could never miss something they had never experienced. But once they experienced it and lost it, the absence became impossible to fully ignore. Keep watching, because what comes next explains why this realization can stay with them for years. After losing it, they carry something they cannot easily set aside. They carry the knowledge of what was once possible. That understanding changes everything. The independence they once celebrated no longer feels completely fulfilling. During quiet moments, it can begin to feel less like freedom and more like emotional limitation. The self-contained identity they spent years protecting now carries the awareness that real closeness once existed, yet they were unable to maintain it. They remember what it felt like to be deeply understood, accepted without conditions, and emotionally supported. Because of that, ordinary relationships may never seem to reach the same depth again. This realization does not necessarily consume them every single day, but it quietly becomes part of their emotional world. It appears without warning. in relationships that never quite feel complete, in evenings that feel strangely empty for reasons they cannot explain, in silent moments of reflection that they quickly push away because looking too closely becomes uncomfortable. There is another consequence that deserves just as much attention. The betrayal changes not only what they lost, but also who they slowly become. Our lives are shaped by the choices we make again and again during the moments that matter most. Every person has the ability to grow, heal, and transform in meaningful ways. At the same time, repeated decisions strengthen certain emotional habits. Every time an avoidant chooses self-protection instead of vulnerability, those defenses become easier to rely on the next time. Every moment they retreat instead of remaining emotionally present reinforces the habit of pulling away. Every relationship where fear wins over openness makes genuine intimacy feel a little more unfamiliar. Over time, the distance between who they truly are and the protective version they show the world quietly grows larger. This is where the deeper lesson begins, so stay with me, because the next part explains why this pattern can continue for years unless something finally changes. The betrayal does not simply bring one relationship to an end. It strengthens the very emotional defenses that created the loss, making future intimacy increasingly difficult unless they consciously decide to break those deeply rooted patterns. Because of that, the life they continue living may appear completely stable from the outside. They may perform well at work, build successful careers, maintain friendships, and appear calm and emotionally composed. Avoidants are often highly capable of creating lives that look organized, productive, and successful. Yet beneath that appearance lives a private awareness that is extremely difficult to escape. Deep inside, they know something truly meaningful was offered to them, yet they were unable to fully receive it. They understand that a real opportunity existed for emotional growth, deeper intimacy, and a more authentic version of themselves. But they walked away because fear felt safer than vulnerability. That awareness does not always remain at the front of their mind. Most of the time it stays hidden beneath daily routines and familiar distractions. Still, it quietly influences how they experience future relationships, and how they understand themselves whenever moments of honest self-reflection manage to break through the emotional walls they have spent years maintaining. As we come toward the end of this conversation, I want to encourage you to focus on something much more valuable than the idea of justice. It is completely natural if part of you feels comforted by knowing that your pain was not meaningless, and that the person who hurt you is not living without emotional consequences. There is nothing wrong with recognizing that reality. But if your journey ends there, your attention remains fixed on them instead of your own healing. The most important part of this story has never been what happened inside the avoidant. The most important part has always been what has been happening inside you. While they depended on emotional defenses, you faced your pain directly. You allowed yourself to grieve, reflect, grow, and slowly rebuild without hiding behind emotional distance. That difficult process strengthened your character instead of weakening it. Your ability to love with honesty, accountability, and emotional courage did not disappear because of what happened. It became stronger through everything you survived. What comes next may be the most important message of this entire discussion. The avoidant never fully understood what they were risking because the emotional wounds shaping their behavior prevented them from seeing the true value of the connection while it still existed. By the time that understanding finally arrived, the opportunity to protect it had already slipped away. They made life-changing choices without fully understanding what those choices would eventually cost. Fear clouded their perception, causing them to treat something deeply valuable as though it could always be recovered later. What deserved honesty, awareness, and emotional courage was instead handled through confusion, distance, and emotional self-protection. The consequences of those decisions did not disappear when the relationship ended. They quietly became part of their inner world, shaping how they experienced themselves long after the temporary comfort of emotional withdrawal faded away. The relief created by building emotional walls was always temporary, but the cost of keeping those walls standing became lasting. That truth matters because it reminds you that your experience was real. What happened between you was meaningful, and the emotional consequences did not exist only on your side of the relationship. The impact reached much farther than the moment everything fell apart. But even more important than what happened inside them is what happened inside you. While they were protecting themselves from difficult emotions, you were doing the far harder work of facing them with honesty. Through heartbreak, uncertainty, disappointment, and grief, you slowly built something no one else could have given you. You developed self-respect that no longer depends on another person's approval. You discovered an inner confidence rooted in your own character, instead of someone else's ability to recognize your worth. You realize that your ability to love deeply is not a weakness, but one of your greatest strengths, and that you deserve a relationship where that love is returned with equal consistency, honesty, and commitment. None of that growth happened by accident. It was not simply an unexpected result of your pain. It became the most meaningful part of your journey, transforming an experience that once wounded you into one that also revealed your resilience, your courage, and your true strength. The avoidant entered the relationship without fully appreciating what they had. Because of that emotional blindness, they made choices that slowly destroyed something genuinely rare. You, however, walked away with something they never expected: a stronger heart, a clearer sense of self, and the ability to recognize the kind of love that will never again ask you to shrink yourself just to keep someone close. In losing you, they also lost the chance to continue becoming the person your love had quietly encouraged them to become. Your presence created a space where they could have moved beyond old defenses and discovered a more genuine way of living. But they were unable to recognize that opportunity until it no longer existed. You, however, experienced a very different outcome. Even though you endured the confusion, the emotional distance, the silence, and the exhausting process of rebuilding your life, you did not lose the most important part of yourself. Instead, you found it. You discovered a deeper understanding of your own worth, healthier boundaries, greater emotional wisdom, and a stronger connection with who you truly are. That growth did not erase the pain, but it gave the pain a meaning that reached far beyond the relationship itself. That is why this story is ultimately not about the avoidant's regret. It is about your transformation. Their greatest loss was the connection they failed to appreciate until it was gone. Your greatest gain was discovering that your identity was never dependent on another person's ability to choose you. The confidence you have built, the emotional clarity you have earned, and the understanding that you deserve to be loved with the same openness, honesty, and devotion that you freely give to others, have now become permanent parts of who you are. No one can take those gifts away from you. They cannot be undone by another person's fear, emotional distance, or inability to receive love. They belong entirely to you because you created them through your own courage, resilience, and willingness to keep growing. In the end, that is the only lasting victory that truly matters. Relationships may begin and eventually end. People may leave, and valuable opportunities may be lost. But the person you became through the experience remains with you forever. That is the one thing no betrayal can ever destroy. And it is the only outcome that was truly worth fighting for. Stay with me, because the final lesson may be the one that changes everything. If there is one last thought I want to leave you with, it is this. Do not make the mistake of believing your story reaches its ending the moment the avoidant finally realizes what they lost. That realization, if it ever comes, belongs to their journey, not yours. It is one chapter in their psychological experience, but it was never meant to become the destination of your healing. Too many people unknowingly place their emotional freedom on hold while waiting for someone else to recognize the value of what they walked away from. They convince themselves they will finally feel at peace when the avoidant regrets their decisions, offers an apology, returns to the relationship, or when life eventually teaches them the lesson they refused to learn while love was still available. But if your healing depends on their awakening, then your peace is still living inside their choices. That means your emotional future remains connected to someone who already showed they could not carry that responsibility. Real healing asks something completely different from you. It asks you to reclaim your life long before they ever understand what they lost. It asks you to stop making your future dependent on their level of awareness. Whether they eventually see the truth or spend the rest of their lives avoiding it, your opportunity to build a peaceful, meaningful, and deeply fulfilling life already exists today. The moment you stop measuring your progress by what is happening inside them is the moment your own transformation begins accelerating in ways you never thought possible. One of the greatest misunderstandings about heartbreak is believing the goal is to completely stop loving the person who hurt you. Real healing is rarely that simple. Love does not instantly disappear because someone disappointed you. Feelings do not vanish just because logic says they should. What changes is not always the existence of love, but the place it occupies inside your life. At first, it may feel like the center of everything. Every memory pulls at your heart. Every unanswered question demands another explanation. Every quiet moment reminds you of what might have been. Then, little by little, almost without noticing, something begins to shift. Keep watching, because this quiet change is where true freedom begins.